My name is Owen Hayes, and at 35 I've managed to build a life around a fortune so vast it sometimes feels like it belongs to someone else. The last valuation of my company put my net worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 million, a number that still doesn't compute. I've made my home in Vancouver, a city where the persistent rain seems to wash the streets clean each night, leaving behind the glow of neon and the constant comforting scent of brewing coffee. My house is a modern construction of steel and glass that overlooks the Burrard Inlet. Every single morning, my first sight is Clara, the woman I love more profoundly than I have words for. Beside her, our 6-month-old son, Leo, sleeps in his crib. A perfect little being with eyes that hold the brilliant light of a clear sky. He is the center of our universe, but a life, no matter how polished it looks from the outside, is never as clean as the pictures suggest. The money, the public profile, the lavish parties, swimming in expensive wine, it's all just a glossy, fragile coating. It's a veneer stretched thin over the deep, splintering cracks in my heart. And those cracks, the ones that ache on the quietest nights, trace back to my family. To be precise, they trace back to my parents, Robert and Susan Hayes. My childhood unfolded in a forgettable town a few hours outside Vancouver. It was a place defined by flat, monotonous fields, rolling under a perpetually gray sky that felt like it was pressing down on you, smothering any flicker of ambition. My parents were not nurturing people. Warmth wasn't in their vocabulary. My father, Robert, was a mechanic whose hands were perpetually stained with grease and whose rage could ignite without warning. I learned to read the tension in his shoulders. He was a man of guttural growls and sudden shouts, and the sting of his hand across my face for some minor infraction. A dropped fork, a page left unturned in a textbook, was a familiar pain. My mother, Susan, had a different kind of cruelty. Her violence was silent. She never laid a hand on me, but her gaze was sharp and dissecting, and under its weight I always felt like a profound disappointment, an error she was forced to endure. We weren't destitute, but money was a constant source of friction that suffocated our house. Life was just a repeating loop of simmering resentment that boiled over into bitter arguments, followed by a silence that was somehow even worse. By the time I turned 15, I knew with absolute certainty that I had to get out. It was a matter of survival. I looked at my father, a man soured by resentment for his own life, and my mother trapped in a cycle of complaint about everything she lacked, and I felt a cold dread. I would not become them. So I threw myself into my books. I studied until my eyes burned, treating school not just as an education but as my only possible escape route. That scholarship to MIT wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a lifeline, and I grabbed it and never looked back. It was at MIT that I found a sense of order and purpose in the world of technology. The clean logic of coding felt like a refuge. It was a universe where I had complete control, where I could translate ideas into something real and functional just by typing lines on a screen. I was 25 when I launched my first startup. By the time I was 30, I had sold it for an unbelievable $200 million. The money was so immense it felt abstract, like a score in a game. 5 years later, my second company, a sophisticated artificial intelligence platform, was valued in the billions. I became one of those young success stories you read about in Forbes, a regular at global tech summits, living in a house that the boy I used to be couldn't have even imagined. But for all its power, money is a blunt instrument. It can't erase the memories of all those nights I spent curled up in my room, trying to block out the sounds of my parents tearing each other apart with their words. It doesn't mend the deep gashes they left on my heart. More than anything, it doesn't have the power to magically transform Robert and Susan into the mother and father I had always yearned for. When the money first started pouring in, I was young enough to think I could buy a solution. I convinced myself I could fix our broken dynamic. As a first step, I hired a crew to completely renovate my parents' old house, wanting to make it bigger, warmer, and more comfortable for them. I thought maybe changing their environment would somehow change them too. I even bought them a stunning oceanfront villa for more than $10 million, a true sanctuary with manicured gardens and an infinity pool that spilled into the horizon. It was a place of impossible beauty, the kind of home I thought would bring them peace. I gave them a top-of-the-line luxury SUV, the exact model I knew my father had fantasized about for years. I took over every single one of their expenses, utilities, premium health insurance, even the extravagant holidays my mother couldn't wait to tell her friends about. On top of all that, I set up a direct deposit of $10,000 into their account every month just for pocket money. It was an amount I was certain would allow them to live not just in comfort, but in genuine luxury. What I was completely unprepared for was the bottomless nature of human greed. It seemed there was no limit. Every time I called home, my mother had a new complaint, a new need. They needed a bigger television, they needed a trip to Maui, they needed a large sum of cash for one of my father's half-baked business schemes. I tried to satisfy their requests, not out of a desire to flaunt my wealth, but because a part of me felt a gnawing guilt. I thought that by giving them things, I could somehow atone for having left them behind, for having built this incredible life for myself while they stayed mired in their small-town bitterness. But my generosity had the opposite effect. The more I provided, the more insatiable their demands became. It was a gaping hole I could never fill. My mother's phone calls developed this cloying, artificial sweetness. They were suddenly full of hollow praise for me and gushing compliments about my amazing son. My father, on his part, would clap me on the shoulder and call me the pride of the family, but when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see love. I saw a man looking at a walking, talking bank vault. Clara saw it all long before I was willing to admit it to myself. With her warm chestnut hair and perceptive eyes, she has an uncanny ability to read people's true intentions. "Owen," she said to me one night as we were sitting together by the fire, the flames casting shadows across the room. "I don't think your parents love you for being their son. I think they love what's in your wallet." I tried to laugh it off, pretending it was just a silly observation. "Don't be ridiculous," I said, but the words felt empty. Deep down in a place I refused to look, I knew she was speaking the truth. I just couldn't bring myself to face it. Clara is my anchor, the steadying force in my life. We found each other 7 years ago at a tech conference in San Diego. She was a freelance journalist back then, working on a fascinating piece about the societal impact of artificial intelligence. I was completely mesmerized by her. She asked questions that weren't designed to flatter or impress, but were sharp and insightful, as if she was determined to see past the polished CEO persona to the real person underneath. After my panel discussion, I asked her out for coffee, and that was it. We've been inseparable ever since. When Leo was born, I experienced a sense of completion that I didn't know I was missing. Holding that tiny, perfect boy in my arms, feeling his chubby little hand wrap around my finger, I knew this was what mattered. This was everything. Looking down at his innocent face, I made a silent promise to him. He would never, ever have to endure the kind of fear and isolation that had defined my own childhood. Clara and I poured all our free time into him. From the blurry, sleepless nights spent changing diapers to the bright, joyful mornings spent watching him gurgle and laugh in his crib. Our house, for all its modern grandeur, finally felt like a home, filled with the sounds of Leo's life. But I've learned that happiness can be a precarious thing, like a candle flame flickering in a strong wind. It's beautiful and precious, but also terribly fragile. I just never imagined that the storm that would threaten to extinguish it would blow in from the direction of my own parents. That Thanksgiving, we made the decision to drive out to the old town to visit them. I wasn't excited about the trip at all, but Clara gently persuaded me. "They're family, Owen," she said softly. "No matter what has happened, they are your parents. Leo deserves to know his grandparents." I agreed with a nod, but a familiar weight settled in my chest. I didn't want our son to be a stranger to them, but the idea of walking back into that dynamic made me feel like a 10-year-old boy again, bracing for impact. I could almost feel the phantom sting on my cheek. The trip itself was carefully orchestrated. The drive was over 3 hours, and we arrived with a car packed with everything a baby could possibly need: toys, diapers, a portable crib. My parents' house, the one I had spent my entire childhood in, was now almost unrecognizable thanks to my money. The rickety old structure with its mossy shingles was gone, replaced by a bright 2-story home with brand new furniture and a meticulously landscaped garden that my mother proudly called her personal masterpiece. And yet, the moment I stepped over the threshold, that same old chill crept over my skin. It was as if the new drywall and fresh paint couldn't contain the ghosts of the past. The walls themselves seemed to hold the echoes of all those old arguments. My mother pulled me into a hug that was too tight and lasted just a little too long. Her smile so blindingly bright I couldn't tell if any of it was real. "Owen, my boy," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with affection. "Look at you. So successful, and you still remember your old parents." My father clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly but was hard enough to make me lose my balance for a second. "Good job, son," he said, his voice gruff. "I'm proud of you." I managed a tight, forced smile and shot a look at Clara. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. A silent message. "Stay calm. We'll get through this." Leo, nestled in Clara's arms, let out a big yawn and started to fuss. Before Clara could even react, my mother practically lunged forward and snatched him from her arms, showering him with cooing words of endearment I had never once heard directed at me. "Oh, my precious little grandson, you're so adorable. Look at that nose. It's just like his father's." Clara maintained a polite smile, but I saw her fingers tighten around the strap of her purse. Her discomfort was a mirror of my own. Later that evening, we all sat down for dinner. My mother served a huge traditional stuffed turkey, making sure to announce that she'd spent the entire day preparing it. My father uncorked a bottle of expensive wine I had brought as a gift, and spent most of the meal talking about his latest grand investment schemes. "You know, Owen," he said, leaning toward me conspiratorially, "if you'd just lend me a bit of capital, I could open a much bigger auto shop. This town is desperate for one." I just nodded along, murmuring that I would think about it while silently counting the minutes until the meal was over. Later that night, as Clara and I lay in the bed in my old childhood room with Leo sleeping peacefully in his travel crib next to us, I found myself wide awake. I couldn't shake a feeling of unease that had settled deep in my gut. Something just felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Was it the strange look in my mother's eyes when she gazed at Leo? It was a mixture of love and something else, something I couldn't identify. Or was it the way my father relentlessly peppered me with questions about my company, my net worth, my future financial plans? I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself I was being paranoid, just overthinking things. They were my parents, after all. They weren't flawless, but they were still family, and family doesn't intentionally hurt one another, right? I was so naive, so terribly, horribly wrong. I had no idea that in just a few short hours, the entire foundation of my world was going to shatter. I didn't know that the fragile flame of my happiness was about to be violently snuffed out, and that the people I called my parents would be the ones to do it. The next morning, Clara and I woke up to the quiet sounds and clean air of the suburbs. When I went downstairs, I found my mother already busy in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared an elaborate lunch. My father was in the living room, absorbed in the morning paper. The moment he saw me, he jumped up and insisted on dragging me out to the backyard to show off his latest gardening project, which turned out to be just a few sad-looking beds of chrysanthemums. From upstairs, I could hear Clara's bright laughter mingling with Leo's happy gurgles, and for a fleeting moment, a sense of peace washed over me, melting away all my anxieties. But the feeling was short-lived. As we got closer to lunchtime, my mother announced that she needed some extra ingredients and suggested we drive to a market about 15 minutes away to pick them up. "You two go on ahead," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Just leave Leo here with me." Her tone was pleasant, but there was a flicker in her eyes that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Clara looked over at me, her own expression full of hesitation. "Are you sure, Susan?" she asked carefully. "Leo is only 6 months old. He can get pretty fussy with strangers." "Oh, don't you worry about a thing," my mother said, waving a dismissive hand and letting out a loud, forced laugh. "I raised Owen, didn't I? I think I can handle one little baby. It's no trouble at all. Go on, you two deserve some time to yourselves." My father chimed in, nodding enthusiastically and giving my shoulder another one of his heavy-handed claps. "Listen to your mother, Owen. She's got this under control." I looked at Clara, trying to gauge her true feelings. She gave a small, hesitant nod, but I couldn't miss the way her knuckles had gone white as she gripped her purse. "All right," she finally said, her voice strained. "But please, Susan, be careful not to let him play with any small toys. I saw that little plastic ring with the tiny beads in it yesterday. He puts absolutely everything in his mouth right now, and it's a choking hazard." My mother just laughed again, waving away the concern as if it were a silly overreaction. "Don't you worry, Clara. I know what I'm doing. I'll make sure he only plays with his safe toys." I could see Clara was still reluctant, but she eventually nodded, gently placing a sleeping Leo into his crib and pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Mommy will be right back, my love," she whispered. We left the house and drove toward the market in the town center. I tried to relax and enjoy the rare moment of being alone with my wife, but my thoughts kept circling back to Leo. "Are you all right?" I asked, watching her. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on something far away. "I don't know, Owen," she admitted. "Your mom. I'm just not sure she's as careful as she says she is. I just have a really bad feeling," she continued, her voice low. "You're worrying too much," I said, trying to sound reassuring even though I didn't fully believe my own words. "Mom isn't perfect, but she would never let anything happen to Leo. He's her grandson." Clara nodded slowly, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't convinced. She turned to stare out the window, her hands twisting her empty coffee cup over and over. About half an hour later, after we had finished shopping and were getting ready to drive back, my phone rang. My mother's name lit up the screen. I actually smiled, assuming she was just calling to tell me how adorable Leo was being. But the second I answered, her voice, ragged and panicked, tore through the phone. "Owen, you have to come back right now. It's Leo. Leo, he's not breathing." My heart seized in my chest. I froze. Beside me, I heard Clara let out a sharp gasp as her coffee cup fell from her hand, splashing hot liquid all over the car's floor mats. "What did you say?" I yelled into the phone, my voice cracking with disbelief and terror. "What's wrong with Leo? What are you talking about?" "Just come back now," my mother shrieked, and then the line went dead. The next few moments are a blur. I don't remember running to the car or starting the engine. All I can clearly recall is Clara's desperate crying, her hand gripping mine with crushing force, her voice a raw, shaking plea. "Owen, drive! Hurry!" The drive back to the house felt like an eternity, though in reality it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. I mashed the accelerator to the floor, flying past speed limits, my mind a complete roaring void except for one repeating image. Leo, my tiny boy with that smile that could melt my heart. No, this can't be happening. It can't be real. I couldn't even let myself complete the thought. We burst through the front door to find my mother standing in the middle of the living room, her face a ghostly white, her hand clutching at her chest. My father was right beside her, his eyes wide with a frantic, helpless panic. "Owen, Clara, I don't know what happened," my mother stammered, tears carving paths down her face. "I just left the room for a second, and when I came back, Leo was—" I didn't hear the rest of her sentence. My entire focus narrowed as I sprinted to the crib. There, my little boy was lying perfectly still. His eyes were closed and his skin had a pale bluish tint. I reached out and touched his cheek, desperately hoping for warmth, but his small body was already cold. "Leo!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and broken. Clara collapsed to her knees beside me, gathering Leo into her arms, her body racked with uncontrollable sobs. "My baby," she choked out, her words lost in a torrent of grief. "Mommy's here, please, open your eyes, please." I don't know how long I just knelt there, shouting his name, holding my wife and my son. All I know is that when the police and ambulance finally arrived, they had to physically pull me away from him. A female paramedic with her hair pulled back in a tight bun knelt by the crib and immediately began chest compressions, her partner working to administer oxygen. Her actions were quick and efficient, but I saw the look that passed between them. A silent, grim exchange that held no promise of a miracle. Clara clung to me, her fingernails digging into my arm as if I was the only thing holding her up. "They're going to save him, right, Owen?" she whispered, but her voice broke, as if she already knew the devastating answer. I couldn't speak. I just held her tighter, my gaze locked on Leo's still form. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the paramedic looked up at us. She slowly, sorrowfully shook her head. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice gentle and low. "The child has no vital signs. We did everything we could." A raw, heart-shattering scream tore from Clara's throat and she crumpled to the floor. I dropped down beside her, pulling her into my arms, the entire world dissolving into a haze of pain and disbelief. Leo, my son, my light, my joy, was gone. I looked at his small, still body, at his cold skin, and felt my own heart being squeezed in a vice. My mother was huddled in the corner, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "Owen, I don't know what happened," she repeated over and over, her voice a trembling whisper. My father stood next to her, his face ashen, muttering to himself. "How could this happen? How?" Two police officers immediately took control of the scene. One of them, a tall man with a calm, deep voice, introduced himself as Officer Davies. He gently asked us to step back so they could preserve the area. "I know this is an incredibly difficult time," he said, his eyes filled with a genuine empathy that was still undeniably professional. "But we need to understand what happened here. Who found the child?" My mother spoke up, her voice thick and choked with tears. I was the one watching him. I only stepped out of the room for a second to get a glass of water," she continued. "And when I came back, he wasn't breathing. I tried to shake him, to wake him up, but..." Her voice dissolved into another round of heaving sobs. I stared at her, trying to see past the tears and panic, searching for the truth in her eyes. Was this just a horrible accident, or was there something else here, something I couldn't see? Officer Davies scribbled notes in his pad while his partner, a younger female officer, began to photograph the scene. She moved with quiet purpose, carefully inspecting the crib. Then she picked up a small piece of brightly colored plastic, a broken fragment from the very toy Clara had warned my mother about. "We found this in the crib," she said, sealing the piece in an evidence bag. "This could be it. It's a clear choking hazard." Clara, who had been trembling silently in my arms, suddenly looked up, her expression hardening. "I told her," she said, her voice turning to ice despite the tears streaming down her face. I told her that toy was dangerous. I specifically warned her not to let Leo anywhere near it. Officer Davies glanced at her, his expression unreadable as he made another note, but he didn't say anything. The silence in the room became heavy and charged, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting for the other shoe to drop. After the paramedics left, Leo's tiny body was carefully taken to the coroner's office for an autopsy. Officer Davies explained that it was mandatory for any unexplained infant death. "We need to determine the precise cause," he said gently. "It's most likely a choking incident, but we have to be absolutely certain. We will let you know the results as soon as they are available." The police remained for another hour, meticulously examining the house and questioning both my parents and us. They asked my mother to walk them through every single thing she had done before finding Leo unresponsive. They asked Clara and me about his habits, about the toy, about any detail that might be relevant. I answered their questions on autopilot, my mind a fog of grief, wanting nothing more than to hold my son one last time. Clara was different. Her answers were sharp and clear, but I saw the way her eyes kept flicking toward my mother, her gaze as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. That night, Clara and I didn't even try to sleep. We just sat together in the living room next to Leo's empty crib, wrapped in a silence that was heavier than any words. The pain was a physical thing, a ravenous creature gnawing at my heart, taking me apart one agonizing piece at a time. Clara leaned her head on my shoulder, but her body was tense and rigid, as if she were fighting a furious battle within herself. My mother kept trying to comfort us, attempting to hug Clara and repeating over and over how sorry she was. But I watched as Clara subtly recoiled from her touch, her eyes filled with a dark and growing suspicion. The following morning, as we were packing our things to leave that cursed town, Clara pulled me out into the backyard where we couldn't be overheard. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying, but her voice was steady and firm. "Owen," she whispered, her gaze intense. "I don't believe this was an accident. Your mother knew that toy was dangerous. I warned her, and she still left it in his crib. Doesn't that seem strange to you?" I stared at her, a part of me wanting to push back, to tell her that her grief was making her see things that weren't there. But the conviction in her voice, the cold certainty in her eyes gave me pause. I glanced back at the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see my mother at the sink, her shoulders slumped, looking utterly heartbroken. My father sat at the table, blankly turning the pages of a newspaper. From a distance, they looked exactly like what they were supposed to be: grieving grandparents. But then my mother happened to glance up, and our eyes met through the window for a brief second. What I saw there felt wrong. It was a coldness, a strange detachment, as if she were wearing a mask. I reached for Clara's hand and squeezed it tightly, a tiny, sickening spark of doubt igniting in my chest. "If you're right," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I swear to you we will find out the truth. For Leo." 5 days later, the autopsy results came back. I got the call from the coroner's office on a gray, rainy morning. I was sitting alone in my study, just staring at a family photo on my desk, the three of us smiling. The coroner's voice was clinical and detached. "Mr. Hayes, the cause of death for your son Leo has been determined to be asphyxiation due to the obstruction of his airway by a small plastic object, consistent with a piece from a toy. There were no signs of other injuries. Our conclusion is that the death was accidental." I hung up the phone, a wave of nausea washing over me. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Accidental. The word echoed in my head, sharp and hollow and meaningless. I wanted so desperately to believe it, to accept that it was just a tragic, horrible accident and that no one had meant for my son to be hurt. But Clara's words from that morning in the backyard kept replaying in my mind, a sharp, persistent thorn. Her suspicion that my mother had deliberately left that dangerous toy in the crib wouldn't let me go. I stared out the window at the rain streaking down the glass and felt lost. Was my own grief twisting my thoughts, or was there something terribly wrong here? Leo's funeral was held on a gray, miserable day, as if the sky itself was mourning with us. The cemetery was on the outskirts of Vancouver, a quiet place where rows of silent birch trees shed their leaves onto the wet earth. Clara wore a simple black dress, her face pale, her swollen eyes concealed behind dark sunglasses. She clutched my hand with a desperate grip, her body trembling so hard I worried she might collapse. I wasn't doing much better. Standing there in front of that tiny white coffin, I couldn't process the reality of it. My son, my beautiful, perfect boy, was gone, reduced to a name that would be carved into a cold piece of stone. My parents were there too, standing a few feet away from us. My mother was weeping loudly, a theatrical display of grief that drew looks from the other mourners. My father stood beside her in silence, his head bowed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I wanted to believe in their pain. I wanted to think that they were just as shattered as we were by the loss of their only grandson. But every time I chanced to look at my mother, I would catch her gaze flicking toward us, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't grief. It was something else, an assessing, observant quality that made my skin crawl. Clara didn't say a word, but I knew she felt it too. As the priest began the final prayer, Clara squeezed my hand and whispered, "Owen, I want to go home." We drove back to our glass house on the hill, but it no longer felt like a home. The sound of Leo's happy gurgles was gone. The soft sound of Clara humming lullabies was gone. All that was left was a crushing, suffocating silence, a lead blanket pressing down on my chest. Every night I would lie awake for hours staring at the ceiling, trying to conjure the image of Leo's smiling face. But the only image my mind would allow me to see was him lying still and cold in his crib, his eyes closed forever. A few weeks after the funeral, while the pain was still a raw, open wound, my parents showed up at our front door unannounced. My mother immediately pulled me into a hug, her face wet with fresh tears. "Owen, my boy," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "your father and I just couldn't bear the thought of you and Clara suffering all alone. We're family," she continued. "Let us stay with you for a while. We want to help you both get through this." My father nodded in agreement, giving my shoulder his customary clap. But for the first time, I noticed his hand was trembling. "That's right, son," he said. "We want to be here for you." Clara was standing behind me, silent and still. I turned to look at her, searching her face for some sign of consent, but she just gave a curt, reluctant nod, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. I knew she didn't want them in our house, but I felt too exhausted to argue. The grief of losing Leo had hollowed me out, and a small, weak part of me, the part that still foolishly longed for a real family, clung to the hope that maybe their presence could help fill the vast emptiness. So they moved in, bringing a few suitcases and a constant stream of hollow platitudes and empty words of comfort. My mother took over the kitchen, cooking elaborate meals that neither of us had any appetite for. My father busied himself around the house, fixing things that weren't broken. A perfectly fine kitchen cabinet hinge, a light bulb in the garage that was working just fine. For the first few days, I tried to believe they were genuinely trying to help. But it wasn't long before I started to notice strange things, small dissonances that I couldn't ignore. Clara, as always, was the first to sense that something was truly wrong. One morning at the breakfast table, she pushed her plate of scrambled eggs away, a grimace on her face. "Owen," she said, her voice sounding distant. "I feel so exhausted, my head is just buzzing like I haven't slept in days." I nodded because I felt the exact same way. I was tossing and turning every single night, even after taking sleeping pills. My vision seemed blurry at the edges and my limbs felt heavy like I was moving through water. It felt like a dark cloud was following me everywhere I went. "It's probably just stress from work," I said, trying to rationalize it for both of us. "And, losing Leo." But Clara shook her head. "No, Owen, this is different. This isn't normal grief. I've never felt like this in my life, don't you see? Ever since your parents got here, we've both been getting worse." She spoke in a low voice, her eyes darting toward the kitchen where my mother was at the sink, humming some old, cheerful tune. I wanted to tell her she was being paranoid, but I couldn't deny the truth. My own health was in a sharp decline, the constant dizziness, the way I would jolt awake in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. It was all getting worse. It had all started the day my parents moved in. I kept trying to push the suspicion away. They were my parents. They had lost their grandson. They were just trying to help us. But then a memory surfaced, a small detail I had dismissed at the time. A few days earlier, I had walked into the living room and overheard my mother on the phone, her voice low and tense. I know, she was saying. But we just need a little more time. I will handle it." The second she saw me, she abruptly ended the call, her face breaking into a bright, forced smile. "Just an old friend, dear," she had said, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to eat at me, but I still wasn't ready to confront what it might mean. Not until one morning when everything came crashing down. We were on our way to see a therapist, a last-ditch effort to find some way to cope with the suffocating grief of losing Leo. Clara sat beside me in the passenger seat, silent, her hands twisting in her lap. The road we were on was a winding mountain pass with a sheer drop on one side and a dense pine forest on the other. I was trying to fill the heavy silence, telling her about some new project at work when the car suddenly lurched forward. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal. Nothing happened. The brakes were gone. I stomped on the pedal again and again, but it was completely dead, sinking uselessly to the floor. "Owen!" Clara screamed, her hand flying to the door handle. I yanked the steering wheel, fighting to keep the car on the road, but we were going too fast. The car hurtled toward the cliff edge at a terrifying speed. I heard the horrifying shriek of metal on metal as we smashed into the guardrail, and then the world tilted as the car flipped onto its side. My head slammed hard against the driver's side window, and a blinding flash of pain shot through my skull. I heard Clara scream my name, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was on a stretcher. The red and blue lights of an ambulance were flashing rhythmically, slicing through the steady rain. Clara was sitting beside me, a bandage wrapped around her head, her face pale and streaked with blood from several cuts. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I managed a weak nod, even though a searing pain was radiating from my left leg. Later at the hospital, the doctors confirmed I had a fractured femur. Clara had a concussion and a number of cuts and bruises. We were incredibly lucky to be alive. But as I lay there in that hospital bed looking at Clara's battered, sleeping face, a cold certainty settled in my gut. This was not a random accident. The days that followed were a blur of physical pain and gnawing suspicion. I was eventually discharged from the hospital with a pair of crutches and a long list of prescriptions for painkillers. Clara, despite her own persistent headaches from the concussion, insisted on taking care of me. But we both knew that our physical injuries were the least of our problems. It was the suspicion about my parents, the people who, despite all their flaws, I had always believed were still my family, that was poisoning every moment of our lives. They were still in our house, keeping up their charade of being a loving, supportive family. My mother cooked constantly, fussing over us and asking about our health, while my father spent most of his time in the garage, claiming he wanted to inspect the rental car the insurance company had provided after the crash. "Let me take care of this, son," he said, patting my shoulder with that familiar gesture. but his smile now looked like a grotesque mask. "You just rest." But I couldn't rest. I couldn't relax for a single second. Every time I looked into my mother's eyes, I saw that same cold, detached expression, the one I had tried so hard to convince myself was just a figment of my imagination. Every time my father put his hand on my shoulder, it no longer felt like a gesture of affection. It felt like he was sizing me up, like a predator circling its prey. And our health, both Clara's and mine, continued to get worse. The dizziness, the insomnia, the profound, bone-deep fatigue. It wasn't getting better. I started to wonder if this was really just the aftermath of trauma, or if it was something much more sinister. The suspicion was no longer a small, nagging thought. It was a raging fire in my chest. I started paying attention to every single detail. I noticed the way my mother insisted on preparing all of our food and drinks, the way my father kept finding excuses to go out to the garage. I replayed the crash in my mind, the brakes suddenly failing, the steering wheel vibrating violently. And a horrifying possibility took root. Had my father done something to my car? An opportunity to find answers presented itself one evening when I was talking to our next-door neighbor, Mr. Peterson. He was an elderly widower who lived alone, and he was obsessed with security. His entire property was surrounded by a network of high-tech surveillance cameras. "Owen, I heard about your accident," he said, his voice full of genuine concern. "Are you and Clara all right? You're both so lucky to be alive." I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Thanks, Mr. Peterson, just bad luck, I guess." Then it hit me. His cameras. One of them was pointed directly at our driveway and garage. "Hey, Mr. Peterson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know this is a strange question, but did your cameras happen to catch anything unusual the night before our crash? Anything around our garage?" He raised an eyebrow at the question but didn't push for an explanation. "Let me take a look," he said. I hobbled after him into his house, each step with my crutches a painful effort. But the adrenaline surging through my veins numbed the throbbing in my leg. We stood in his small, cluttered living room and watched the security footage from that night. The images were sharp and clear. There was my father, opening the hood of my car. He leaned over the engine for more than 20 minutes, his hands busy with something I couldn't quite make out, before closing the hood and walking away as if nothing had happened. The blood roared in my ears. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Can you send me a copy of this video?" I asked, my voice shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. "Of course, Owen," Mr. Peterson said, his face etched with worry. "Are you all right? Is something wrong?" I shook my head, not wanting to pull him into the middle of this nightmare. "Just need to check on a few things," I lied. "Thanks, Mr. Peterson." When I got back to the house, I didn't tell Clara what I had seen right away. I needed to process it myself, to let the horrifying reality sink in. But the suspicion had now solidified into a cold, hard fact. My father had tampered with our car, and if Clara had been right all along, if my mother had intentionally put that toy in Leo's crib, then we were living under the same roof as monsters. I decided I had to be smart, to move quietly. Using some advanced security software from my own company, I installed a series of tiny hidden cameras throughout the house. In the kitchen, the living room, and especially in the garage. I told Clara about my plan late one night after my parents had gone to sleep. "We need proof," I whispered. "If they are really trying to harm us, I will not let them get away with it." Clara nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. "But we have to be so careful, Owen," she whispered back. "If they find out we suspect anything, I don't know what they might do." A few days later, the cameras captured something that made my blood run cold. It was footage from the kitchen. My mother was preparing dinner, and she pulled a small, unmarked glass vial from the pocket of her apron. She looked around quickly to make sure she was alone, And then she carefully sprinkled a fine white powder from the vial onto my plate and Clara's. Her movements were swift and practiced, like it was something she had done many, many times before. My mouth went completely dry. The dizziness, the insomnia, the crushing fatigue, it all suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. I turned to Clara, who was watching the footage with me on my laptop screen. "They're poisoning us," I said, my voice cracking. Clara's hand flew to her mouth and silent tears began to stream down her face. "Owen," she whispered, her voice filled with terror, "what are we going to do?" I didn't have an immediate answer. All I knew was that the unmarked vial was the key to everything. The next day, after my parents had gone out for a walk, I went into the kitchen and found the vial hidden at the back of a cabinet. I carefully extracted a small sample of the powder, then drove to a private lab that my company had worked with in the past. "Test this," I told the lab manager, handing him the sample. "And I need the results as fast as you can possibly get them." The lab results came back 3 days later, and they confirmed my absolute worst fears. The powder in the vial was a slow-acting, cumulative poison. With prolonged exposure, it caused severe liver and neurological damage, and it was nearly impossible to detect without highly specialized testing. I just sat in my office, staring at the report, feeling the world crumble around me all over again. My own parents, the two people who had brought me into this world, had not only deliberately murdered my infant son, but they were now slowly, methodically trying to kill Clara and me. And for what? For money. For their insatiable, bottomless greed. I clutched the report in my hand, my heart a raw, aching wound, but through the pain, a cold fire of determination began to burn. "They will pay for this," I whispered to the empty room. "For Leo. For everything." The lab report lay on my desk like a death sentence. The hidden camera footage of my mother poisoning our food, the security video of my father sabotaging our car, and the memory of my son's death on that awful Thanksgiving weekend, they were all pieces of the same horrifying puzzle. They were the undeniable proof of an evil I could never have imagined. My parents, the people who were supposed to be my family, had murdered my son and were now actively trying to murder my wife and me. For money. For their sick, endless greed. I sat there in my office, staring at the pile of evidence I had gathered, feeling as if my chest was collapsing in on itself. Clara stood beside me, her hands shaking but her eyes filled with a hard, unwavering resolve. "Owen," she said, her voice low and steady, "we can't wait any longer. We have to do this for Leo." I nodded, each breath a painful effort. "I know," I whispered back. "But we have to do this the right way. We need the law on our side." I immediately contacted Amelia Reed, a top criminal attorney in Vancouver whom I knew through a business associate. I sent her everything I had, the video footage, the toxicology report from the lab, and a damning recording from a private investigator I'd hired. He had managed to capture a phone call in which my mother referred to Leo's death as a planned accident. Amelia listened to everything, her voice grim and serious over the phone. "Owen," she said, "with what you have here, we can absolutely pursue charges for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted aggravated assault, and potentially even homicide in connection with your son's death. But how do you want to proceed? Do you want to confront them directly, or do you want to go straight to the authorities?" I hesitated for a moment, my mind filled with the image of Leo's face, of my mother's cold eyes, of my father's phony smile. "I want to confront them," I said, my voice hard. "I want to hear them admit what they did, but I want you there with me, and I want the police there too." Amelia agreed, and together we formulated a plan. The dinner that evening felt heavy and oppressive, like the air before a violent thunderstorm. I sat at the head of the dining table, my crutches leaning against the wall beside me, struggling to keep my expression neutral. My mother carried a steaming casserole to the table, her face arranged in a sweet maternal smile. "Owen, Clara," she said, her voice so cloyingly gentle it made my stomach turn. "I made this just for the two of you." My father sat opposite me, sipping his wine, his eyes darting toward me, assessing me. Amelia and a police officer she had arranged to accompany her, Officer Miller, arrived at exactly the right moment. I introduced them as a colleague and a friend, but I saw my mother's entire body go rigid the moment she saw Officer Miller's uniform. "A police officer?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh, that's unexpected." "Just a friendly dinner, Mom," I said, forcing a tight smile. "Please sit down. Let's eat." The meal started in a tense, awkward silence. Clara and I just pushed the food around on our plates, claiming we were on a new health regimen. I saw my mother shoot a look at our full plates, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she could hide it. Amelia kept up a stream of cheerful, meaningless chatter, but Officer Miller just sat there, silently and methodically observing everyone at the table. Then I decided it was time. I reached for the remote and turned on the large television screen mounted on the dining room wall, which I had already connected to my laptop. The security footage from the garage began to play, showing my father leaning over the engine of our car. "What were you doing to the car that night, Dad?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "The brakes failed. You knew they were going to fail, didn't you?" My voice started to rise, the rage I had been suppressing finally breaking through. My father leaped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as it toppled over. "Owen, what the hell is going on here?" he roared. "Are you actually accusing your own parents?" he yelled, but his eyes were wide and frantic, darting around the room like a cornered animal. Amelia spoke up, her voice calm but cutting like a razor. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," she said, "we have laboratory analysis confirming the presence of a slow-acting poison in Owen and Clara's food. And this video," she gestured to the screen, which was now playing the footage of my mother sprinkling the powder from the vial, "shows you Mrs. Hayes deliberately administering that poison." My mother collapsed into a storm of loud, theatrical sobs, burying her face in her hands. "Owen, I didn't want to do it," she cried. "It was your father. He made me do it. He said we needed the money, that you had too much and didn't deserve it all. I just went along with it." Her confession, even though I had been expecting it, felt like a physical blow. I stared at her. This woman who had once sung me to sleep, now admitting to such an unspeakable betrayal. My father lunged toward her, his face purple with rage. "You lying bitch," he screamed. "I didn't make you do a damn thing." He then made a break for the door, shoving a chair out of his way. But Officer Miller was already on his feet. He tackled my father to the ground, his voice sharp and clear as he spoke into his radio, calling for backup. Within moments, the sound of approaching police sirens filled the air. My father was cuffed, his face a twisted mask of fury and desperation as he was escorted out to the waiting patrol car. My mother just sat there, slumped in her chair, sobbing hysterically. "Owen, I'm so sorry," she wailed. "I never meant for Leo to die. It was an accident. It was all just a terrible accident." But her words were just empty noise now. I turned my back on her, unable to even look at her face. A few moments later, Officer Miller and his colleagues returned, and they handcuffed her and led her away too. After a long conversation, Clara and I made the decision to press charges against my parents for murder, poisoning, and attempted aggravated assault. 3 months later, the case went to trial. The proceedings lasted 4 days and became a massive media sensation in Vancouver. Amelia, representing our family, was brilliant. She systematically laid out every piece of evidence, every frame of damning video, every damning lab result, every damning word from the secret recordings. Finally, the judge, a stern, no-nonsense older woman, stood to deliver the verdict. Her voice was clear and strong as it rang through the silent courtroom. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Leo Hayes, this court finds the defendants, Robert Hayes and Susan Hayes, guilty. On the charges of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted aggravated assault against Owen and Clara Hayes, we find the defendants guilty. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. My mother let out a wail and collapsed in her chair. My father started shouting, "You have no right! You can't do this!" before the bailiffs moved in, handcuffed him, and led him from the courtroom. Clara and I just held on to each other, tears streaming down our faces, not tears of joy, but of a devastating, brutal relief. Justice had been done, but the hole in our lives was too vast, the pain too deep, to ever truly be healed. A year after the trial, Clara and I went to visit Leo's grave. It was a quiet cemetery on the edge of Vancouver. A gentle autumn wind was blowing, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The small white headstone engraved with our son's name, Leo Owen Hayes, our little angel, stood silently on a patch of bright green grass. I knelt down and placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums at the base of the stone. I let my fingers trace the letters of his name, as if I could somehow feel his warmth through the cold, smooth marble. Clara stood beside me, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, the other holding my hand in a tight grip. She was 7 months along with another baby boy, a new, unexpected light entering our world. But on that day, we were there for Leo, to let him know that he would never, ever be forgotten. The past year had been an impossibly long and difficult journey, full of dark days and moments when I honestly didn't think I could go on. After the trial, after my parents were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Clara and I sold the glass house overlooking the inlet. That house, the place where we had once dreamed of building our future, was now haunted by too many painful memories. We moved to a smaller home in a quiet coastal town about an hour's drive from Vancouver. Our new house wasn't nearly as grand as the old one, but it was cozy and warm, with big windows that looked out over the ocean and a small garden that Clara tended to with loving care every single day. We needed a place where we could begin again, a place where we could try to heal, even though we both knew that the wound of losing Leo would be a part of us forever. I severed all ties with my extended family on my parents' side. The relatives who had stood by them, the ones who had called me a traitor for what I had done, were now just ghosts, faded names from a life that no longer existed. I had come to understand that family isn't about blood. It's about who loves you, who protects you, who would never, ever hurt you. Clara and now our unborn son were my only true family. In Leo's memory, Clara and I started a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting other families who had lost young children to preventable accidents or violent crimes. We organized workshops to raise awareness about child safety, teaching parents everything from how to choose safe toys to how to properly child-proof their homes. Every time I stood up in front of a room full of parents, I would tell them Leo's story. I didn't do it to relive the pain, but to remind them that every single child deserves to be protected, to be kept safe. Clara would often stand beside me, speaking about the warning signs we had missed, the cold, calculating look in my mother's eyes, the small, unsettling details we had brushed aside. "Trust your instincts," she would always say, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The foundation wasn't just a way to keep Leo's memory alive, it was our lifeline. It pulled us out of the darkness. There were still days when I would wake up feeling like I was suffocating, the grief so heavy I couldn't breathe. But then I would think about the letters we received from the families we had helped, the pictures of the smiling children whose lives we had hopefully made a little safer, and it would give me the strength to keep going. Today, standing here at Leo's grave, Clara was wearing a loose, comfortable sweater that couldn't quite conceal the gentle curve of her belly. Do you think this little one will be like Leo? She asked, her voice soft and full of a fragile hope. I looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and I managed a real smile. I think so, I said. He'll be just as wonderful as his big brother, and we will protect him no matter what. I thought about the name we had chosen for our new son, Ethan. It's a simple name, but it means strong and enduring. We wanted Ethan to grow up in a world that was safe, a world free from the kind of shadows that had stolen his brother from us. I placed my hand on Clara's belly and felt a gentle flutter, a tiny kick from Ethan, and a warmth spread through my chest. You're going to be our new joy, Ethan, I whispered, and we will tell you all about your big brother so you will always know how amazing he was. Clara leaned her head on my shoulder. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. Leo is watching over us, Owen, she said. I know he's smiling down on us right now. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. I could picture him so clearly with his bright, beautiful eyes somewhere up above, watching over his family. And I knew that even though the pain of losing him would never completely disappear, we would find a way to keep living. For him, for Ethan, and for ourselves. As we turned to leave the cemetery, a rare sliver of Vancouver sun broke through the heavy gray clouds. Lighting up the path in front of us, I held Clara's hand, walking slowly. My crutches now replaced by a simple cane. Our lives had been irrevocably altered, but I had learned a brutal, unforgettable lesson. I had learned that greed has the power to corrupt and destroy even the most sacred of bonds. And I made a silent promise to myself that I would live the rest of my life differently, focusing only on the things that truly mattered: Clara, Ethan, and the precious memory of our firstborn son. We didn't need the mansion or the magazine covers anymore. We just needed each other and a home that was filled with real, unconditional love. As we drove away along the coastal highway, Clara started to hum an old lullaby, the same one she used to sing to Leo. Her voice was soft and clear, filling the quiet space inside the car. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a tiny spark of hope begin to glow in my heart. Leo would always be a part of our story, and Ethan would be our new beginning, our new light guiding us forward out of the darkness.